G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a fantastic weekend. Now legends, of course, as always, there is a lot to go over and we're going to be covering many different sectors of war today. We're going to be looking, of course, at frontline tactics, strategy, what is moving, and then we need to look at both the diplomatic sector, what the politicians are doing, what they are saying, what ministries of foreign affairs are saying, and then we need to look at intelligence operations as well. We need to look at the warning that Russia's foreign ministry service, the SVR, has given. But we also, with anything released from an intelligence service, need to see that this could be an intelligence operation within itself. So what we're going to do is then look at the claims around false flags and look at the benefits, the risk ratio of them, and when and why do nations or non-state actors carry out false flags and come to a conclusion of how likely is something like this. And then, of course, we're going to look at what Medvedev and then the Russian Foreign Ministry has said about then the short, medium-range missile treaties with a moratorium released today too. So, of course, a lot to go over. So where we're going to start, I think, is the biggest news of the day is with India. Now, we know India, regardless of what Trump says about the economy, India is a behemoth, especially when you look at it in purchasing power parity and, of course, look at the population, not only within India, but also outside of India too. Trump has said this: India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, they are then, for much of the oil purchased, selling it on the open market for big profits. Who's buying it, Don? They don't care how many people in Ukraine are being killed by the Russian war machine. Because of this, I'll be substantially raising the tariff paid by India to the USA, of course, a large trading partner. Thank you for your attention on this matter. And India, they haven't pulled any punches either, and they are not having it. India has then made this statement from the official spokesman from the Ministry of External Affairs. India has been targeted by the United States and the European Union for importing oil from Russia after the commencement of the Ukraine conflict. One thing you and I have been speaking about in the past days is there is specific targeting of India and not targeting of other nations, especially Turkey, China, and others, doing the same thing. In fact, India began importing from Russia because traditional supplies were diverted to Europe after the outbreak of the conflict. The United States at that time actively encouraged such imports by India for strengthening global energy market stability, which is true and something we went over the other day and we'll rehash it today. 2. India's imports are meant to ensure predictable and affordable energy costs to the Indian consumer. They are a necessity compelled by global market situation. However, it is revealing that the very nations criticising India are themselves indulging in trade with Russia. Unlike our case, such trade is not even a vital national compulsion. So India saying, well, due to the diversion of these energy products, we had to do this to look after our own energy stability in line with the framework you made. 3. The European Union in 24 had a bilateral trade of 65.5 billion euros in goods with Russia. In addition, it had trade in services estimated at 17.2 billion euros in 23. This is significantly more than India's total trade with Russia that year or subsequently. European imports of liquid natural gas in 24, in fact, reached a record of 16.5 million tonnes, surpassing the last record of 15.2 million tonnes in 22. 4. Europe-Russia trade includes not just energy, but also fertilisers, mining products, chemicals, iron, steel and machinery, and transport equipment, some that are exempt as well from sanction. 5. Where the United States is concerned, it continues to import from Russian uranium hexafluoride for its nuclear industry, palladium for its EV industry, fertilisers, as well as chemicals. 6. In this background, the target of India is unjustified and unreasonable. Like any other major economy, India will take all necessary measures to safeguard its national interests and economic security. And that is what we speak about of reason of state, or raison d'etat, about states will primarily look after their own interests first. We do see America doing this with big America, little America, aka Israel, looking after their national interests first. And when we're speaking major players, when we speak US, Israel, India, China, that there are no permanent friends or enemies, there's only strategic interests. And your energy is one of the key pillars of your sovereignty in independence. And of course, your ability to compete on the global markets as well. So this is what we went over the other day. And we are correct that there is very confusing messaging from Washington around what is actually going to happen here. We did talk about India's strategic autonomy, that officials will continue to prioritise cheap energy and their national interest, and they will not compromise India's growth or Indians themselves for making Washington happy. Also, the double standards here, China, Turkey, and where India has called out other than European nations as well as America. The price cap hypocrisy as well, that the West pushed India to buy Russian oil under a price cap to stabilise that market, is now moving the goalposts and now punishing them. And this transactional diplomacy, that using an unrelated issue to then buffer your trade negotiations that the US, Washington, wants with New Delhi. And following the last couple of weeks, every time Trump says Biden's war, it's getting more and more ridiculous. And this is from I believe, a New York Times article. Early last year, senior officials at the US Treasury Department visiting New Delhi said India was working within a formula that was proving effective, keeping Russian oil flowing into global supply, but at a cheap enough price that it would shrink Russia's revenue. They bought Russian oil because we wanted somebody to buy Russian oil at a price cap. That was not a violation from the US ambassador to New Delhi. It was the design of the policy. You can see where India's going, hang on, you're still buying all this product. You are implicating one of our key pillars of sovereignty here. What is going on? And we will see what will come over the next coming days. And Zelensky, he has tweeted this, I presume in relation to this. Russia is dragging at the war against Ukraine for one reason only. It has the money to keep the war going. It's not really why they're dragging out the war. If they had the money to end the war tomorrow, they would. The reason they're dragging out the war is for attritional strategy to reduce then Ukraine's ability, both domestically and internationally, to influence politics. They can keep it going because of the more money, but it makes strategic sense to drag out the war. All sanctions that restrict Russia help bring peace. All weapons that strengthen Ukraine help bring peace. All political actions that isolate Russia help bring peace. I'm grateful to Trump for his determination to end the war and corresponding pressure from the United States. A shift in sentiment is already being felt in Russia, and the new decisive steps and new strong sanctions will push Russia towards peace. So again, what we're hearing of peace through strength, and that it will be Russia coming to the table begging for peace through a decisive victory, through decisive steps on sanctions and rearmament. What I'm saying is Russia's not really fighting that war. They're fighting this long attritional war, attriting their own economy, knowing it's going to have post-war attrition and flow-on effect too, but also attriting at the front line. There's different wars being fought here. We'll go over more of that at length. Also, me and Dr. Connolly, we are in discussions. Of course, the economist who comes on the channel every couple of months, we will give a full update on this. We may just delay it until Trump's ultimatum comes through. We'll get a better idea. Maybe we'll just do 2. But this is one of Ukraine's, if not Ukraine's, best known activists, and probably the best connected activist as well. A few million on YouTube, 500,000 on X, incredibly well known through all, even before this war as well. Incredibly, is an activist online, not willing to be an activist at the front line and fight, but has tweeted this: India is scum, a country complicit in the murders of Ukrainians. But I'd like to refer back to this about who is funding billions upon billions whether to India to buy oil that originated in Russia or is still conducting direct trade from everything from hexafluoride to other bits and pieces. Who's buying it? And also then China, every product that people are importing from drones, everything is all made in China as well. And he says this: we are setting up checkpoints near medical universities. And this is, of course, concerning after the discrimination we saw against Indian students at the beginning of the war, leading for then India to operate Operation Ganges to pull those students out. We do know that in the beginning of the war, there was 18 to 20,000 Indian students enrolled in medical universities in Ukraine. Many were pursuing medical degrees and have paid a heavy price financially for that as well. And this does concern me about setting up, like, who is setting up checkpoints around this? Is it the Ukrainian government? Is it individuals? What is happening here? And you may say India, but it's not then all 1.5 billion Indians are all complicit in this, even if they're living in different states or paying to study somewhere. Again, the complicit list, if you want to step back and do second stage of who is funding this war machine, I'd be turning my eyes to the west of Ukraine a lot for continuing buying the product, or for the last decades buying at a reduced price. Let's have a look at the maps. So, of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. And something that we have going on, which should be alarm bells ringing, is two major cities being fought over. Of course, the first one, Pokrovsk, which you've probably heard about. The second one is Kupiansk, which no one is talking about. Kupiansk is a logistics hub. It is very important, and not much sits behind Kupiansk. Of course, you've got to cross the Oskil, makes this very, very difficult. And it is, for the first time, we've seen two major cities being fought over at somewhat opposite ends of the battlefield, north and south. That is a huge problem. And you can see why this may not be by luck. It may be intentional, fabricated for this to occur as well. Speaking on protracted attritional war, that when you're on the offensive, you are seeking to go across a broad front and overwhelm the enemy at multiple points using shallow attacks. To remain inside your layered bubble of friendly protective systems, don't move more than where your drones and EW can reach you. And what you're wanting to do is stretch depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses, or until you have less resistance in some area. And this is the exhaustion of why the Russians are in Kharkiv, why the Russians are pushing around in the south, why they may be targeting across Kherson. But the primary objectives at the moment are Kupiansk, Pokrovsk. It weakens that, but also having two at once, I don't know if Ukraine has the reserve to stabilize either one of them, but two at a time, this may be part of Russia's strategy as well. If there's a collapse, there will be a cascading effect in a crisis in one sector, forces defenders to shift reserves to another sector. Crisis in Pokrovsk, the reserves rocking up there, again, like I said yesterday, not coming from some mythical base where there's thousands of soldiers sitting around. They are coming off other areas. We will start seeing that move. Same with Pokrovsk. Two at once, very difficult, and only to generate a crisis there in turn. And you may get this fallback cascade that occurs through defensive lines. So let's then talk about Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, see where things are moving. Firstly, let's talk then about Pokrovsk, and this is really bad. What we see is confirmed movement on the north of Rodianske. This is exactly what we spoke about. There are only two roads coming in and out of here. And we know the survival of the road, well, we have been told from Ukrainian sources, is 50%. The Russians are less than 3 kilometers from this road. And of course, this road is much closer from the other way, but you've got 13 from here and 4 from, wrong one. We're talking the road here, 7 from here and 11.5 from here. That this area can be completely covered by drones. That leads to a huge issue, and we're talking in attritional nature of war. And Rodianske, the fall of this area has all the ingredients to be catastrophic for Pokrovsk, Minograd, and this whole sector, and we don't know where that would stop beyond. Now, let's talk about Pokrovsk. Let's have a look at some maps, see what is moving, and we can see this on the Syriac maps. situation on this front. The last 3 days, Russian army took full control over this area and approached the northern outskirts of Luhansk. In addition, Russian forces entered this coal mine where battles with the Ukrainian army are beginning to take place for this mine and the Telecon. So you can see actually on both these maps, although showing somewhat different, of course, there's a lot more control in Suryak up this train line here. You can see that at least on these axes, there's definitely been some amount of movement. And this situation is growing more and more critical. And what I mean by that vertical envelopment and strategic envelopment rather than physical, we see like this today. So just out in this sector, you can get an idea. We'll overlay it here. This is where these gains are today. We see a Ukrainian T-64 being targeted by then a Russian drone. And we can see just the sheer amount of drones that have control on the northern outskirts of these areas as well, that it's likely far more dangerous out where my cursor is now than down along this sector here. And that tells us a lot, and the ability to either need to have a withdrawal and the cost that may come with that, or a push on the flanks, withdraw at the same time. Again, very, very difficult situation. It is a crisis which is occurring, but there's a second crisis of which is not spoken about, is of course up here of the city of Kupiansk, another logistics regional hub. I don't know why. Well, I do know, but we do know why this isn't being spoken about that much. Let's have a look at Suryak maps. Northeastern front, in the last 4 days, Russian army made new advances in the northern part of Kupiansk, advancing along these streets here into the stadium. In addition, Russian forces took control over a series of positions inside Moskovska and entered Kupiansk city from the axis along the street, so along from the north and the northwestern side. Of course, the typical envelopment of this area. So you can see how much different this looks from Moskovska on that western side, northern side from Bradkivka down. Suryak saying there is break-in, and the grey zone showing that there is at least movement there. The problem with Kupiansk, the major issue is, one, any logistics hub, if you gain that, you gain a logistics hub, not only what could be left there, but also the road, the trains, etc. If there's higher ground, you know, so you can see the roads heading out of Kupiansk, but also the Oskil. So the Oskil runs down here. There's been, of course, Russia trying to target a lot of bridges, and there's a lot of heavy equipment that sits on this side. And just like Kursk, you could see this equipment not be able to be brought across a water obstacle, and therefore a lot left behind in this sector, while there's two cities currently getting enveloped, or that are enveloped, and it's squeezing, I should add. AMK mapping, he has this good infographic here of the roads, the logistics routes in here, and of course the Oskil running through. But AMK says this. Firstly, AMK had me almost die of laughter yesterday with his updated reactions. But the Kupiansk sector, the Russians continued their offensive on Kupiansk and have reached the city centre. So he says, reaching the city centre, they advanced in two areas. In the east, they pushed south down the highway, clearing the houses on these streets. In the west, Russian forces cleared the rest of the industrial zone from central Moskovska, as then Suryak maps spoke about. So movement into the centre of Kupiansk. Again, very critical area that is then being squeezed while Pokrovsky is being squeezed and attrited as well. He says this: I'm honestly surprised at how little people are talking about Kupiansk. The city has been on the front lines for nearly 3 years, and Russia is on the brink of capturing it. Russian forces have rapidly reached the city centre from the north and are now just 1.5 kilometres from the main bridge over the Oskil, connecting the Ukrainian bridgehead on its eastern bank, including eastern Kupiansk, to the rest of Kharkiv. Once this highway is cut, all supplies in the pocket, as I showed you, will have to go via bridge to the south, Kupiansk, this area, or over pontoon bridges. This creates a bottleneck that can easily be targeted, which will naturally result in the collapse of the bridgehead, the alignment of the front across the river, and a refocusing of efforts to complete the capture of the city and surrounding areas. Supplies are already difficult for the armed force of Ukraine fighting in the bridgehead. The only thing preventing the current Russian assault operations there from achieving breakthroughs is the natural obstacles and significant fortification line in Russia's way. While the fall of Kupiansk may not be imminent, there is real threat of its northern bridge being cut, which will undoubtedly create massive problems for Ukrainian forces in the area. And someone asked me yesterday about how long until Kupiansk and Pokrovsk fall. And Russia at this point, they want to focus on the squeeze, the attrition, and the pressure of these sectors to create opportunities rather than just gaining those areas. As I always say, towns, cities, territories, settlements is a byproduct of the strategy of attrition more so than the primary number one goal. It's to reduce potential, okay? It's highly understood, but on purpose misunderstood. Okay, so let's have a look on the maps, see where some other things are moving. We have around Velika, Novosilka, this area filling into the northeast of Zelny Pole. I believe we also have a Suryak maps update in Siversk and Terny. Yes, we do. So, sorry, my phone is going off. Not important. Situation Siversk front. In the last 3 days, Russian army managed to consolidate in some parts of the grey area east of the town in Siversk. So we get a good idea in here. I showed you that geolocation here yesterday, and you can see from Serebryanka all the way down past the Vykonomansky front that Russia is choosing to push this up. Likely as the flank through the Kremenar forest is moving, but this will go for Liman, Yampil, and the forested area creates a large difficulty for a flank as well. And then we'll come up into Terny. Of course, we know the area. As I said yesterday, as I've said for months, one of the more dangerous sectors because there is a complete envelopment in here. It's actually a smaller area to go through. It's a larger envelopment than both Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. Of course, doesn't have the resources in here, but still, though I said Russia will try and push to the north and south and expand this due to the saturation of defense. And at least by the Suryak maps down in the south, this is exactly what he shows that the Russian forces are doing. Okay, the Czech president, he has spoken about the situation on the war, Petra Pavel, with an interview at the BBC saying, right now, Ukraine with all Western support is not in a position to liberate occupied territories in short time frame without significant costs to lives. And of course, it will be very unfair from the West to push Ukraine to liberate all occupied territories right now, because we don't want to exterminate the Ukrainian nation. This is exactly, well, one, look at Boris Johnson, but secondly, exactly what we've been saying is you cannot sacrifice, or his term, exterminate the people for the territory of a nation. We want them, Ukraine, to survive as an independent sovereign country. And if there is a cost to renewing Ukraine as an independent autonomous state, if the cost is to accept that part of the territory will be temporarily occupied without recognising it legally, then so be it. We will never recognise these occupied territories as legally Russian. But what I would say is then the war, from what I'm saying, is not going to stop unless it is then recognised either. Very difficult situation that is occurring. He continues. If there is a price for restoring Ukraine as an independent state, if the price is to accept that part of the territory will be temporarily occupied without legal recognition, then let it be so. So saying that if an area has to be temporarily occupied without recognition, that that's the way to survive. But you see where there's paradoxes coming into this because you've got to play ball on both sides. Ukraine Pravda said this about the interview at the end too. Pavel said that it was the interest of both sides of the Atlantic to exert much greater economic pressure on Russia, noting that such pressure was very effective in terms of persuasion. So far, economic pressure on Russia hasn't been very effective in terms of persuasion. He believed that, given the current state of the Russian economy, the Russians would not be able to withstand economic pressure for long. I've heard that before. As well, given the state of the economy, given the state of Frontline too, I know where, if I was a betting man, I'd be saying what's going to give first. Therefore, he argued, if those measures were implemented, Russia would eventually have no choice but to sit down the negotiating table, which is currently refusing to do. No, Russia is willing to sit down, but on the terms reflected on the battlefield and their requests. Now, some will say, well, they're delivering ultimatums, not negotiation. Fair enough to say that, but this is what you get when you are in a position of power. This is exactly what you are trying to look at Zelensky's statement, look at other parts of this. This is exactly what you're trying to do, is bring Russia to the table on your terms. Okay? Russia's bringing you to the table on their terms. You're trying to bring them on your terms. It's the same game being played. You just don't like it or won't accept it being played the other way without decisive victories, which is highly unlikely. So we will see, but we can still see this area of delusion around what it actually is looking like at the moment and how then eventually the politics will be influenced by, how does Big Serge put it, the boot, the bullet, and the bomb, or something like how the front line, the realities will influence negotiations whether you like it or not. Now, I said we're going to speak a little bit about intelligence operations, and a little bit, maybe it's more than that. But TASS, Russian news agency, has said in this article titled UK Secret Services Plotting Maritime Ecological Disaster, Foreign Intelligence Service, or better known as the SVR. Now, with all intelligence reports, we have to take into account that this within itself can be an operation. This is why it's so hard, and especially with any official statements from warring parties, well, how can you take this as not being part of an overall strategy, optics, intel, everything? Again, you know what I think about anything official, especially when it comes to official numbers. But let's look at this and let's break down where there may be some truth in it. United Kingdom's secret services are planning to enlist NATO allies in a large-scale operation targeting Russia's shadow fleet, which could lead to an environmental disaster in international waters. The press bureau of the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, said in a statement obtained by TASS. The statement said British secret services are planning an ecological disaster in international waters. The press bureau of the Foreign Service of the Russian Federation informs that, according to the information coming from the SVR, the British secret services are planning to involve NATO allies in a massive roundup for the shadow fleet. So there's an incident so large that NATO allies can't ignore it and round up that shadow fleet. According to London's plan, the impetus for such a campaign should be provided a resonant incident involving one or more tankers, create, of course, an ecological disaster. The plan involves organising a major act of sabotage, the losses of which would allow the transportation of Russian oil to be declared a threat to all international shipping. This would unite Western countries' hands. This would untie Western countries' hands in choosing methods of counter-action. Scenarios and actors. According to the SVR, the British are working on two potential casus belli. The first scenario implicates setting up an unwanted tanker accident in one of the bottlenecks of sea communications, for example in the Straits. As it is believed, in London, oil spills and fairway blocking would provide NATO countries with sufficient grounds. So what we speak about up here, declare a threat to all shipping, untying their hands for establishing a precedent of extraordinary vessel inspection under the guise of maritime safety and environmental regulations compliance. Second one involves setting fire to a tanker at a loading port in a state friendly to Russia. It's expected the fire would cause significant damage to the port infrastructure and spread to other vessels, which would require an international investigation. London, and hoping for the same outcome of, well, we need extraordinary circumstances to then look into these vessels. I'll take that back in a sec. Sorry, my phone's going off. London is going to entrust Ukrainian security forces with the implementation of both terror attacks. They expectedly dirty work and inability to cover up their tracks are considered by the British as a guarantee of impunity for themselves. The international investigation would hold either Russia or Ukraine, at worst, responsible for the accident. Similar to the situation with the Nord Stream gas pipeline explosion. So regardless of how it goes, either Russia or Ukraine will be held responsible and we will wipe our hands with it. Now, we have spoken about this before. We spoke about this vessel here, the Ursa Major going down, which was completely underreported. And what I was told at the time was if this was an intelligence operation, although it may have been carried out by some, these operations are enabled by many. And this sinking of a ship in the Mediterranean could delay leading-class nuclear icebreaker. And we see this, the loss of 2 reactor hatches. And this went down in the Mediterranean. And the second it went down and we learnt what was on it, alarm bells went off. And in this article it says, transporting massive custom-made covers for the vessel's nuclear reactor, the 45-ton heavy reactor hatch covers provide access to the vessel's power plant. The loss of the reactor covers represents a further setback in leading-class icebreaker program. So, of course, we see Russia building its icebreaker program, working with China a bit on that too, for power into the Arctic, and we see the West is very, very behind on nuclear icebreaker. The only ones making them are Russia at the moment, but also wanting to gain a lot more power and influence in the Arctic as well. That's why when we looked at this, alarm bells started going off, and that at the time carried out by some, enabled by many. As per speaking here, the SVR pointed out the timing of the UK attack is intended to be chosen so as to use the media effect from it to put pressure on the administration of the US President Donald Trump. So Trump may be on the fence about further actions and tip him over the line. The aim is to force Washington, in defiance of its national interests, to impose the most severe secondary sanctions against Russian energy resource buyers, making them seen as indirect culprits of the tragedy. It seems like nostalgia for the lost dominance at sea and for the authorised by the Crown pirate lawlessness have completely derived the British intelligence of the remnants of common sense. It's high time for the British colleagues to understand that their increasingly bold attempts not only to get back at their rivals, but also cause damage to the global energy security and ecology are capable to make even their most loyal allies run out of patience. So how this too can have a backfire, and we could see further operations too. But realistically, could we see something like this? We see an operation done somewhat as a false flag, somewhat as just an intelligence operation to lead to more decisions being made. And you've heard me talk a lot about false flags, and I thought I would share this again. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically say, which one of these is more likely to be Ukraine, more likely for Russia? Which does it complement the most? And is it more likely for Russia to carry out a false flag or Ukraine and its allies to work for something like this as well? False flags during war. When and why they are used. So when states carry them out, you can do the maths yourselves. When you're losing ground militarily, to change momentum or regain initiative through manipulation rather than strength. Of course, this can be a lot when all of your support base is outside of your nation. Before major offensives or escalation as a justification. So escalation too can be seizing, holding, exceptional rules around things like shadow fleet boats too. When domestic support is collapsing, so you suppress dissent by manufacturing outrage for fragmented population. We've definitely seen domestic support on the rocks recently when international sympathy shifts to the enemy, or not only sympathy, but to change narratives and portray further the opponent as the aggressor. To derail peace talks. If a fraction benefits from continued war, a false flag can sabotage negotiations. To distract from internal political or economic crises. We know what is happening, especially in Kyiv right now, before elections or leadership transitions. This sort of goes into the one above of to distract from political economic crises. And talking of leadership, there's a lot of people questioning the leadership at the moment. So this is when. And if you were to add up that which one of these is more likely at the moment, I've been saying for several months now, it is more, if you were to add up and calculate these, Ukraine would tick more of these boxes than Russia at the moment. Why states use them? Justify new levels of violence or unconventional weapons. Things like chemical attacks, etc. To frame the enemy and influence international media, especially effective in asymmetric wars where perception matters more than firepowers. Or in wars where you're reliant on outside power, where your perception, your optics, how it's seen, matters a hell of a lot to what then becomes. Okay? That is a big tick in the box. To discredit the enemy and manipulate global narratives. False flags can paint the adversary as barbaric or irrational. To provoke an overreaction. To trigger intervention by allies. For instance, staging attack to appear the allies' interests were hit, obliging them to act. Ecological disaster. To create internal paranoia and mistrust in the enemy's ranks. To delay enemy offensives or change their focus, divert attention and respond to a scandal or alleged atrocity. To provide plausible deniability for covert operations, masking an actual attack by blaming it on third parties or rogue actors. To influence post-war narratives or justify war crimes. False evidence laid during conflict can be used in tribunals, media, or historical accounts. And being used in the media, of course, then influences this narrative that we speak about and how important the perception is. Now you can see that if you do this is why I've said it is far more likely at this point in time, with Ukraine with problems in Kyiv, in the government, there's of course people questioning the legitimacy of Zelensky internally too, as well as then losing ground militarily. and further wanting intervention from allies, why Ukraine and its closest allies may look at something like this. I'm not saying therefore it's going to be done, but I think it gives us a good starting point to go, well, the most likely, if we did see it at something like this, would be more likely an intelligence operation from Ukraine allies rather than Russia. It doesn't tick enough boxes at the moment, especially given any false flag has a very large risk reward. The risk reward, Ukraine got caught basically red-handed. Not basically, they got caught red-handed with Nord Stream pipeline. Nothing occurred. Now, we can carry that through and go, well, their reward versus risk ratio is a lot lower than Russia's. If Russia gets caught doing something like this, if it false flag gets caught, well, next thing, the last thing Russia want is more international intervention and sanctions. So they're sort of keeping it on the play, and it's not meeting that threshold of risk versus reward, at least what I'm seeing. Okay? So let's speak more, and let's have a look at the short, medium range and INF that's occurred in the memorandum that's occurred on this. Now, Medvedev has tweeted this, and Trump will be spinning in circles at the moment. The Russian Foreign Ministry statement on the withdrawal, we're going to go through it, of the moratorium on the deployment of medium short-range missiles is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russia policy. So buck passing, saying it's a result of you and creating as a victim. It's not that simple. But this is the reality of our opponents will reckon with. Expect further steps. So that, look, you're doing it, we're doing it too, changes the framework of security in Europe. Now, the US, they withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, citing Russian non-compliance. Russia has since said it would not deploy such weapons, provided that Washington did not do. So that even though it's not there in play or you're pulled out of it, as long as you don't, we won't. But it seems there's been a large change on this from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Now, you can go through all of this if you'd like, but we may just belt feed through it. That the termination of the treaty in 2019, the Russian Federation made proactive efforts to promote restraint in this particular area. These efforts were reflected in top-level statements made in 19 and 20, which included Russian voluntary assuming unilateral self-restraint on deploying ground-based INF systems for as long as similar US-made missiles do not emerge in the corresponding regions of the world, which now they're saying that they are. It's being thrown out. Russia directly called upon NATO countries to declare a reciprocal moratorium on deploying weapons that had been banned under the INF Treaty. Most simply, this was any weapon that sits between 500 and 5,500 kilometres. So short range, particularly, is because you're not going to have any warning on these systems not then reaching into orbit and having time. Now, regrettably, it says Russia's initiatives were not reciprocated. The US and its allies openly declared their plans to deploy US ground-based INF missiles across the regions and moved along significantly in their efforts to implement these plans. Since 2023, we've observed such instances of US-capable ground-launched INF strikes being transferred to European NATO countries, trial use during exercises that have clearly have an anti-Russia slant, such as exercise in Denmark, which involved the use of a mobile Mark 70 launcher. And this is basically just a Mark 41 vertical missile launcher that is scalable into a containerized system. So it can sit on a boat, it can be dropped out of a C-17, out of a C-130, basically it sits in a shipping container. And what they're saying here is, well, the systems inside that, they then breach that radius of ground-based systems. It's not that simple, though. But we also see this. In the Asia-Pacific, did I miss a bit here? Wait, we'll come back to it. In the Asia-Pacific, we know that under pretext of exercises, a Typhoon mid-range capability missile was delivered to the Philippines in April 24, and we see the major exercise going on at the moment in Australia on Talisman Sabre. We see firing of things like HIMARS systems. Now, which has been tested, depending on, at a range exceeding, they say, 500 kilometres. And we have heard a lot about updates to the HIMARS is going to have modifications of expected ranges up to 1,000 kilometres. And this is where we get into the official range of these versus what they can actually fire on both sides of the aisle. And a lot of this is being done to discredit the US Indo-Pacific posturing to justify closer Chinese or Sino-Russian military alignment. We know Russia particularly is wanting to build that alignment together, maybe even to some level of formal alliance. It's not really China's way of conducting military politics, but we will see that it is then leaning on that outside of their region as well. So, as we get this, future modifications are expected to exceed ranges of 1,000 kilometres, and this is that 505,500 kilometre band. Now, Russia has a number of systems that clearly violate this. The 9M729 and the Iskander M9K720. I forgot the NATO designation of this first one. I'll put it on the screen if I forget. But although they claim the official range is 500 or less kilometres, like the claim around some of these other systems or updates to them, this is done on official stances because we could see that these may fire much further. And why is Russia doing this? Okay, well, in my opinion, you have official withdrawal, a moratorium on this, you release this statement, it goes through the media. What we then may see is these systems either used at their full range or other systems enter the battlefield that would have then breached this originally. Even if that weapon could fire 800 kilometres, that it wouldn't because of this in place. So I think this is Russia creating an environment to justify using some of these weapon systems. Let me know if you believe I'm correct or not. The plan by a number of US allies to acquire ground-based INF systems from Washington and or develop their own missiles with ranges falling within this bracket to expand their existing national arsenal of such weapons constitute an additional important factor. The above steps by the collective West form and build up a destabilising missile capabilities in the regions that are adjacent to the Russian Federation, clearly threatening a deployment to Kaliningrad, Crimea, Belarus, potentially even Transnistria. Again, we will see, but that's what I believe that is hinting towards. Russia has consistently made it clear this scenario will have our country take offsetting military technical measures in order to neutralise emerging threats and to maintain strategic balance, aka you're getting into a bit of a arms race again here. And what I see is escalation, but disguised as diplomacy and finger pointing that you did this, we did that, blah, blah, blah. That is Russia wanting to escalate into using some of these weapon systems and threatening nations around. And this is happening both ways, don't get me wrong. There's threats thrown out bloody everywhere. But doing that as shadow disguised in diplomacy in order to bring about further legitimacy to threats and potentially deployment of other systems into the battlefield too. Again, we will see. With everything, time will tell. And I think there's going to be a lot of people look very incompetent when time does actually tell. Legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. I hope that we covered everything major today. And if I didn't, I'll catch you up tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.